let's turn now to the Romans 14 study and talk about that for the next 10 or 15 minutes. We are in this paragraph where we have been discussing the identity of the weak and the strong, and we talked last week about some of the what's I'm looking at the word I'm looking for. Some of the similarities between Romans 14 and our passage here in, say, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 10. There are definitely some similar admonitions that Paul writes about in the two passages, and the people groups that he's writing to have similar characteristics. We have two groups of people that Paul seems to always have in mind, Jews and Gentiles, and the Jews would have been those people groups who are obviously familiar with Torah and have certain amounts of religious scruples that kind of shield them from a measured amount of paganism and idolatry all around them, simply based on their heritage religion and their attention to Torah details and things like that. The Gentile Christians who were coming into this faith community of Jews and Gentiles would obviously have needed a little more time to adapt and leaving behind paganism and idolatry and learning the new walk of faith as they professed, dependency upon Yeshua as Messiah, and learning about the what it means to be holy. In fact, I'm reminded of a recent YouTube sermon that I just watched over at Beth El Gibor's YouTube channel, which you can access straight from my website, by the way. If you log on to go to my YouTube channel and look over on the featured channels or running down the right hand side, there's one that says Beth El Gibor. And just this week, one of their elders, Elder Dan, gave a message on are you kadosh? Are you holy? Are you set apart? Are you someone who lives your life that's different? And he emphasized the Hebrew word kadosh being set apart. And the idea is that the Bible expects us to live lives that are different from the world around us. He referenced that verse where Yeshua, where it talks about how that those who profess faith, I'm paraphrasing, those who believe that Yeshua is the Messiah ought to live and walk as Yeshua walked. So it's not enough just to confess faith in Messiah was the central kind of the message that he was conveying. We as believers have to walk differently. We have to live our lives in a different manner. Of course, we're not going to be doing it under our own power. We're going to be doing it by the power of the Holy Spirit. And so when it comes to the overall message of Romans 14, Paul is admonishing those who are strong, those who are the believers, those who have professed faith and dependency upon Messiah and have received the power of the Holy Spirit within them, to live in such a manner that is not just separated from the world, but also in a way that is not going to tear down the opinions of the weak. So we the strong, which most of the letters, most of this chapter is addressed to, we have this greater responsibility because we have this, we're expected to carry this maturity of that we have of ours as this label strong, and to be able to overcome our flesh and to be able to say no to the old passions and the old jealousies and the rivalries and the factions and all of that other stuff that plagued our lives before we became believers. So having said all that, we're looking now at this chapter from the perspective of a Christian author. And it's no secret that there are differing of opinions between who are the weak and strong in Romans 14 from a Christian perspective and who are the weak and strong from a Messianic perspective. Indeed, if we believe that the strong are Christians, and both sides do, then if we also believe that the weak are, for instance, Jews or people who keep any semblance of Torah, well, then this is going to present a challenge for those of us in a Messianic perspective, those of us who call ourselves Hebraic, those of us who are members of the Torah movement or a Hebraic roots movement, things like that, where we feel that it is a viable responsibility to return to a Hebraic-oriented lifestyle, taking on Sabbaths, festivals, kosher, wearing tzitzit. In other words, we're keeping what would normally look like to most people as things that are tied to Jewishness. And yet this would automatically put us in the category of the weak by most Christian authors. So let's look at this. Who are the weak in faith? Here are now, as we begin to look at a few Christian perspectives, as I say in my commentary, Those of you who are with me in live class should be able to see my screen, and those of you with me on the live the Skype class, you can see what I've got highlighted here. Let's just read down through some of this. Who are the weak in faith? Here's a Christian perspective that I disagree with, but I respect. But I respectfully disagree with. Now that we have briefly addressed the popular 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 Romans 14 verses Romans 14 issued, we can turn our attention to focus on Romans chapter 14 in specific. Germane to our study of this chapter as a whole is the well-established fact that most historical Christian commentaries believe Paul is referring to first century Christians who are weak, whether in faith or in the faith, and most importantly in the opinions of traditional Christian interpretations is that these weak first century Christians were obviously and most likely the first century Jewish Christians, as indicated by their weakness for maintaining a connection to Second Temple Judaic ceremonial aspects of the Mosaic Law. So, in other words, it is no secret that most Christian commentaries and most pastors who take their cue from Christian commentaries that they can read online or have attached to their Bible software, or that they learn in seminary, or that you pick up in a Bible bookstore, the vast majority of Christian commentators are going to tell you that the strong are Christians, particularly Gentile Christians, but would include Jewish Christians such as Paul. And they are strong not just because of their faith in Messiah, but they're strong because they have no hang up in connection to keeping Jewish and religious practices that would tie them to the old way of the old dispensation known as Torah or Old Testament or things like that. They don't feel any obligation to have to keep the law of Moses is what I'm trying to say. And that makes them strong because they have this freedom, quote unquote, to be able to live their lives simply led by the Spirit. They're not tied to the works of the law like we read about in Galatians chapter 5 or anything like that. And by comparison, the weak are those. Perhaps they're still believers. Many Christians commentators identify the weak as believers, but they're believers who are weak because they feel, most of them are Jewish Christians, but some of them would include Gentiles who are familiar with Jewish custom, but they're weak, and they're described as weak because they feel obligated to continue keeping the law of Moses. And this makes them weak because they don't realize that they have a strength, they have a freedom to be able to transcend that, to not be bound to that. In other words, their weakness is that there's in their conscience, they're still bound to all of the old vestiges of the Mosaic Law, and that's what makes them weak. So I obviously disagree with that interpretation, so let's keep reading. As esteemed Christian author and theologian F.F. Bruce notes, quote, weak in faith, not yet mature enough to grasp that all kinds of food are equally kosher, fit, all days are equally holy. In other words, F.F. Bruce, if you look at my footnote tied to his Tyndale New Testament commentaries from the IVP Academic EPUB edition that I referenced here, F.F. Bruce is essentially saying, like many Christian commentaries, that the weak believers in this passage feel that they have to still keep kosher and that they have to keep certain holy days. But the strong believers, by comparison, they don't feel any such compulsion. And so therefore, we, like Paul, who includes himself among the strong, we should endeavor to be strong in our faith, which, of course, from an application perspective, means that those Christians who are still holding on to semblances of kosher diet and festivals and feast days and special days, they should eventually grow up in their faith and put all that stuff away and realize that they have a freedom in Messiah, that they're not bound to all of those ceremonial aspects of the law. I say in my commentary, likewise, Mark Nanos quips, quote, there's almost universal agreement, it appears to be an almost unquestioned fact, that the weak were Christian Jews who still practiced the law and Jewish customs, with most maintaining that this group would have included, quote, God-fearing, end quote, Gentiles as well. So understand what I mean there. Jews who were raised with an understanding to keep Torah, as well as Gentiles who came into a knowledge of Messiah through their affiliation with the synagogue communities. Thus, they were familiar with the proselyte program, and they would have been recognized as God-fearing Gentiles. God-fearing is a term that identifies their association with parts of Torah that were acceptable for Gentiles to keep before undergoing the complete proselyte program. Today, we recognize these as probably the Noahide laws, although perhaps in the first century, those laws weren't yet codified and written down. Maybe they were just kind of in oral fashion. In other words, they were the earlier versions of some Noahide type commandments that would require what we call righteous Gentiles to adhere to certain aspects of Torah while not fully embracing the whole of the Torah as recognized covenant members, such as the proselytes were. So Nanos continues, and the strong, he says, were Gentile Christians, Christian Gentiles as well as Christian Jews like Paul who have supposedly abandoned Jewish practices. So again, this is a kind of an unchallenged view in Christian circles today. Nano's perspective I pulled from his book, The Mystery of Romans, the Jewish Context of Paul's Letter, Fortress Press, 1996. A very helpful book that we're going to find out later on. I'm going to quote from later on in this book, in this particular commentary. So let's look now real quick at a gentleman by the name of D. Martin Lloyd-Jones. He wrote a commentary, a lengthy commentary set that is highly recommended. It's helpful. It's indispensable, in my opinion. It's got some very, very good information in it. It's written from a scholarly perspective, but it's not a scholarly type of commentary set. It's very voluminous. It's got like I can't remember how many. There are 30 or 50. A lot of books is the point I'm trying to make. And I've got the EPUB version here on my computer. But his perspective is decidedly a Gentile Christian in the sense that he doesn't feel that anyone as a believer should really be consider themselves tied to the old Mosaic law and things like that. So let's listen to D. Martin Lloyd-Jones. His commentary, Romans 14, is also representative of the popular Gentile Christian interpretation. And as mentioned earlier, when discussing the Greek nuances of this chapter, he feels that the definite article before faith in verse 1 warrants careful attention in identifying those labeled as weak, labeled by Paul as weak. So he's going to reference what he calls the weak, and he thinks that the Greek "the weak in the faith," as in weak in the faith, owing to a particular kind of faith, is what is going to help us understand what this particular passage refers to. I don't particularly think that that we have to tie into that, and you'll see this in a moment as I read this article, read this particular quote. We'll read this quote tonight, and then this will give us a break point for segment 1. He notes, quote, to begin with, notice that Paul does not say weak in faith. Lloyd-Jones says there's a difference between the two phrases. Being weak in faith means that you do not have power in your faith. You believe things, but you're not so ready to trust yourself to them. A man like George Mueller had a very strong faith. He could believe and trust in God in spite of all appearances. There are others, however, who have weak faith. But here in verse 1, Paul's not talking about weak faith, but about being weak in the faith. So weak in the faith as opposed to weak faith is what Lloyd-Jones is trying to highlight, which is very different, he says. He goes on to say in this particular paragraph, right, starting there, it means being weak with respect to the faith, having a weak understanding of the teaching concerning Christian salvation. The apostle is referring to men and women who get into trouble and are confused and are in a muddle over the outworking of their faith. He goes on to add, then what is the meaning of the term weak? Here again, it is very important that our translation should be correct. The apostle is thinking of a person who's weak for the time being, not permanently. He is saying, now you must deal with people who at the moment or up to this present point have been rather weak or feeble in the faith. They may become strong, and so they should. Let us hope they will. But the point is that at the moment they're weak in the faith. So he's just talking about weak Christians. The way in which the apostle puts it in the Greek compels us to interpret his meaning that way. He does not use an adjective, nor does he does not say the believers are weak. And I agree with his analysis of the Greek there. It's not an adjective, it's a noun. I'm sorry, it's not a noun, it's a verb. He's talking about being weak in faith, and it's a verb in the participle sense, like as in presently ongoing. Let's continue. Lloyd-Jones says, they are weak at the moment, they are in difficulties, and are somewhat feeble in this faith of the matter. In the matter of the faith. He continues, looking now at the whole phrase, weak in the faith, we see that Paul means that these people are truly Christian. There is no doubt about that. They are in the faith, they are born again, they are members of the church, and have every right to be, right? Members of the church. He concludes, where then have these people gone wrong? Listen up very carefully now. In this way, here's how they went astray. Though they have clearly seen the great central matter of salvation, when it comes to particular details of life and living, quite unconsciously, they have dropped back from the faith position into an old legalistic pre-Christian way of thinking and have begun to think of them in terms of justification by works. So he's talking about Christians who are returning to a Hebraic lifestyle. Now, the Jews had been brought up under the law, and one of their great problems when they became Christians was the failure to think in a consistently Christian manner, the failure to think right through in terms of faith. He's challenging Jewish Christians that they should leave behind their connection to the Mosaic law once they become Christians, and any Gentile who wasn't raised with that to begin with shouldn't seek to espouse to take on a Jewish lifestyle like the Jews were keeping. Lloyd Jones concludes, it was the difference between believing the truth about salvation and applying that truth all along the line in all their conduct and in all their daily life and living as they met particular questions and problems. So, as you can see from Dr. Lloyd Jones' comments, he takes the traditional Christian perspective that Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians should be strong in their faith, and that strength is defined by their separation or their distancing themselves or their disconnection from any vestiges of the old, what he called the old legalistic pre-Christian way of thinking, which he's simply trying to describe a connection to Hebraic lifestyle. Dr. Lloyd Jones' commentary was lifted from D. M. Lloyd Jones' Romans, an exposition of chapter 14, 1 through 17, Liberty and Conscience, Banner of Truth, EPUB edition, 2004. And I think, let me just read this last comment here that I added, and then I'll shut down segment 1 tonight. I add, after reading Dr. Lloyd Jones, I put, no doubt Lloyd Jones' perspective is well-meaning and carefully considered in light of the historic Christian opinions that have survived down through history, and his instructions could legitimately be applied in certain Christian contexts, no doubt. Right? There is a sense in which if you are thinking that your connection to Hebraic lifestyle as a Jew or a Gentile is going to strengthen your salvation in Messiah or make you better in God's eyes than someone who's not connected to his Hebraic lifestyle, then you're wrong-headed in your thinking. And that's the context that we could apply Dr. Lloyd Jones' words here if that were indeed what Paul were talking about in Romans 14. But I don't believe that's what he was. So I say in my notes here, however, based on further information that I will share later on in this commentary, I'm going to have to disagree with his concluding opinions on exactly who were the weak and strong in this chapter of Romans. In other words, Dr. Lloyd Jones believes that the weak were Jews or Gentiles who were continuing or espousing to the Hebraic-oriented lifestyle, keeping parts of Torah, religious Jews still holding on to their heritage religion as Jews, or Gentiles seeking to embrace a Jewishly oriented lifestyle that's connected to the what we would call the ceremonial aspects of the Torah. Paul would, in Dr. Lloyd Jones' opinion, Paul would want those weak Christians to seek to be strengthened and leave all that behind and become free in their expression and lifestyle as a believer in Messiah. But in the time being, Paul would tell the strong to kind of put up with the weaknesses of the weak. Don't destroy them. They are brothers, so just kind of help them along until they can get stronger. Kind of like the way you would help someone who's feeble or someone who's immature, and just kind of, how it is. There's always people in your congregation who don't have the same strength in their faith, and so you don't reject them and kick them out of your church just because they have these connections to the Torah. You simply try to help them grow in their faith and to help them understand that they don't have to be tied to that part of the Bible anymore as a Christian. And that's, again, the interpretation and application that Dr. Lloyd Jones is kind of offering, which, again, as a Messianic Jewish man who does keep a Hebraic-oriented lifestyle and also considers myself one of the strong, right, as if that's a contradiction, I disagree. Okay, that'll do it for segment 1. Let's look and see what we're doing by way of time. All right, we went just a little bit over, which I'm trying to give the fair 30 minutes of time to the Romans 14 study as well.